If you have, and you can hear me okay, I thought it's just a 10-minute sort of quick rush through what we call in the landscape or geography of overseas development assistance and international finance. So it's really just to try and establish who's who in the zoo of that world. After having done that, I sort of thought I'd describe a little bit about some of the changing aid modalities, aid ways of delivering aid. Modalities is a over-egged word, and then round off a little bit with the consequences for environmental professionals, assuming that we are all environmental professionals, but it has consequences for everybody as well. So let's go back and look at a little bit of the history, because I think the first thing to mention, just as an intro, is that, of course, corridors and trade routes are not exactly a new experience. East Africa, of course, has been in the trade scene for goodness knows how long, with its various spices and ivory and slaves and everything to Asia. But to jump from that period into the colonial period, they were even talking about corridors of a sort, presumably not development corridors, but extraction corridors, and trying to get resources out in the days of our friend Rhodes, who currently is still sitting on his statue in the UK, but not for much longer, I don't think. And there's the SGR is a lovely example of that, because the original SGR, called the Lunatic Railway, was linking Mombasa up to Nairobi using indentured labor. And in that case, it wasn't to extract the resources so much, it was to settle, of course, and to build Nairobi in the process. Then we sort of moved into the transition rather than the well, it was the post-colonial period, but it was the Cold War period, where infrastructure provision and corridors of sorts were contributing and being developed in terms of independent nation building. And that was really post-colonial period, was being provided from countries like the UK, the old colonial dudes, as technical assistance. And there was 20 years of most of the provision being by technical assistance, with engineers, quite often military engineers, flying in from different parts of the world to build roads in Malawi or railways or whatever it might be. Then we got embroiled a little bit more in the Cold War politics proper. And just as an example of that was the Tanzam, or now Tazara Railway, which was essentially the first major Chinese infrastructure project in Africa, completed in 1975, but took a long time to do. And that had all sorts of political motives relating to the Cold War, with the Chinese-Russian competition going on. The theory was to get Zambian copper out of the copper belt to a different route to the east, to Dar, to try and avoid having to go down through what was then Rhodesia and South Africa and all those regimes in the south. There's also other motives behind it, trying to help Republic of China get into the United Nations instead of Taiwan, who were the members at that point. And it was also a front to train. It wasn't just building the infrastructure; it's the front during the Ujamaa period with Nyeri to train the liberation movements for the South. So we now move into the contemporary period, which is a very potted history, but it brings us to the 35, 40, 50, nobody knows how many African corridors, infrastructure corridors we've had, with a little bit more of a positive message on what they're trying to do. Some of them are trying to catalyze development. The most important actors in that landscape are what we call the bilateral aid agencies. That's the country-specific aid agencies, like the UK's Department of International Development, like the Canadians, the Germans, GIZ, Japanese, JICA, all have their own ways of going about this, but there's a whole array of them all to engage with. In addition to the bilateral aid agencies, you have multilateral aid agencies, who were established at the end of the Second World War to try and sort out the monetary system. Key in amongst those are the World Bank Group. And the World Bank Group, just to confuse issues, has 5 components within it anyway. The ones of greatest of interest to us are what we mostly call the World Bank, but it's actually just the IBRD, the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development. IDA, which is the element of the World Bank that works with the basket cases, basically, soft loans to countries with very poor credit ratings. And then the IFC, which is the private sector arm of the World Bank. MIGA and others we needn't worry too much about. As a subset of those multilateral aid banks, we're familiar with the regional banks, African Development Bank, of course, Asian Development Bank. There's a whole bunch of them, Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank is the latest addition to that lot. And then to try and coordinate this overseas development program, we have various agencies which are certainly worth knowing about. At the international level, probably the most important one for the West, at least, is the OECD DAC, Development Assistance Committee. And they basically have the role of monitoring overseas development assistance and trying to also encourage foreign direct investment. And the key thing they do, many things they do, but we rely on the ODA, on the DAC to determine what is and what can qualify as overseas development assistance, so that the individual countries can try and meet their 0.7 GDP commitments. The EU does a little bit of that, but obviously for the European Union countries only, of which we're no longer a member in the UK. And then the other one, which is probably the most important one to everybody on this program, are the various donor coordination bodies that exist locally. I know there's one in Dar es Salaam, there's probably must be one in Nairobi as well, which brings together all the bilateral and multilateral agencies on usually a weekly basis to check what their program, try and bring some sort of coordination and harmony to what's going on. Then of course you've got all the other actors. Private sector is certainly not least, and they're generally regarded as the drivers of growth. UN agencies, Gates Foundation, philanthropists, and sovereign wealth funds and the like. So it's quite a complex area out there. When we talk about, a reason of trying to map that landscape out is when we talk about the World Bank, it's also very important to realize which part of the World Bank you're talking about when there's 5 dimensions of it, 3 in particular of interest to us. There has been a major and significant change in the way that overseas development assistance has been provided, at least as far as OECD countries is concerned. The old situation in the 70s and 80s was that most of the overseas aid was led by the development agency, by the UK's DFID or the Canadians, the Australians, Germans, whoever it might be. And that tended to bypass the national governments, and they'd go straight in to provide technical assistance for something. So it left the government in the country a little bit as passive observers, quite grateful to receive all this stuff, but you know, they weren't really in control of managing it. A lot of the aid that was provided was also tied to the interests and priorities of the donor country, not the host country. There was a dependency on flying in expensive expatriates with the high transaction costs that involved. The result was basically you had a bunch of bilateral aid agencies and multilateral agencies driving around Tanzania and Kenya with flags on the side of their vehicles in a very fragmented, inefficient, and sometimes competitive way. So there was a need for change, basically. And so the current situation and the principles that we're trying to promote these days are partner country ownership, untying and less conditions attached to aid so that they can be more flexibly used within the host country, greater emphasis on local capacity development to get better value for money, better cooperation between donors, and some of those will, in terms of untying aid, certainly some of them are a little bit keener than others on untying their aid. It's still quite a lot of countries that will only employ their own experts and consultants and scientists. The new framework is being defined in a document called, or an agreement called the Paris Declaration on Aid Effectiveness, to make aid more effective. And there's 4 I've highlighted out of the various principles involved there. And it's just a progress on what we've just been saying. Key principle is greater ownership within the partner country so that the donors are supporting processes rather than substituting them as they had been at the end of the last century. So that also involves getting aligned behind the developing country's priorities, but it's got to be shared. It can't be, I mean, the fear, of course, is that the money will be going to Mercedes-Benzes and military reasons or whatever. But there's got to be, usually as defined by the UN, SDGs are the classic example at the moment, but poverty reduction has always been the key. And in fact, legally, overseas aid, as far as the UK is concerned, has got to be related to poverty reduction. Harmonization, and this actually, interestingly enough for us, the harmonization across the donor agencies, multilateral and bilateral, has led to quite a lot of work that we've done in those agencies, in OECD DAC in particular, on harmonized approaches to environmental impact assessment and strategic environmental assessment, more about which next week. So yeah, it's fairly predictable kind of priorities. What's the consequences as far as corridors is concerned with this change of aid delivery? Essentially what happened, I guess, about 15, 20 years ago is that the bilateral aid agencies retreated from investing in mega projects, not least of which because they were always having problems. There's one famous case called the Poga Dam in Malaysia, where there was all sorts of environmental problems and all sorts of money linked up with military uses and things like that, which hit the headlines in the newspapers. And of course, people in the UK, it was UK overseas aid for that project, was saying, why in the world are we spending British taxpayers' money for this kind of thing? We're not getting it right. So a bit of thinking went around to that and said, well, okay, it's not really for the bilateral aid agencies to get involved in this intricate supply of infrastructure and corridors. We need to retreat a little bit from that and provide strategically targeted aid. And then along came the concept of putting aid into direct budgetary support. That means large tranches of money are put into the budgets of developing countries behind, as I say, this common goals, but very much at the higher level. As long as it's going to be spent on poverty reduction, then fine, and there's all sorts of due diligence that goes with that. But essentially, it gives the developing country control over the monies they get, significant amounts of money, and how they spend it. There's risks involved with that, of course. When you put huge tranches of money, as the British newspapers here point out very regularly, when you put this kind of amount of money in some developing countries, there's sometimes dubious regimes, to say the least. And you want to know what's happened to it, and you've sort of lost track a little bit of how, when you're building a dam, it's easy, you know what's happening to it, but when you're putting it into the budget, you don't know how it's going to be spent. So there was a great movement over the past 20 years to say, okay, well, we're providing a strategic intervention, but in the process, we've got to concentrate on good governance, on trying to address corruption and conflict issues and make sure the system is working. And those little bullet points at the bottom there, which you can study at your leisure later, are how good governance has subsequently been interpreted, because it's very easy to say we need good governance, but what does it mean? Out of all of those bullet points, the ones that will stick out, because it's in red, are the environmental and social safeguards that we need to put in place.
Sorry, John, I'm just going to interrupt here and remind you that you have about 1 to 2 minutes left. Okay. And I know there are quite a number of slides left.
Is there?
So okay. I think there were five slides left on your presentation. So
you can be very quick. All right.
Thank you.
Okay, but so just to put it all in a nutshell then, what essentially happened was that there was a lot of responsibility put over to the World Bank to continue to provide these mega infrastructure projects. And that raised, and of course the vacuum that was created was filled to a large degree by China as well. And hopefully opening up the situation for the private sector. The role of the World Bank and bilateral aid agencies was then very much a case of trying to create a conducive investment environment for private sector to get involved. Environmental social safeguards, I think you're all familiar with this, but it's important to draw that distinction within the World Bank, to know that we have the two major elements of the World Bank that we deal with are the IFC, which is the private sector focused part of the World Bank, and they have their safeguards in place there, the sustainability framework, and they have 8 performance standards, they call them in their terminology. And then the IBRD, the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, focus on government loans. and they have their own, slightly different, a lot of common ground actually. And once the IFC, who really set the benchmark, put their performance standards in place, there was a process where the regional banks, other banks, equator banks, the private sector banks, and ultimately the new kid on the block, Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, set their own environmental and social safeguards in place. But if you look at them, bottom right-hand corner of this particular slide, they're all pretty much the same kind of things, and they all include environmental and social assessment. There's various grievance mechanisms if the money that's being spent by the World Bank or DFID or whatever is not complying with those safeguards. There's all sorts of ways that you can call them to task over that, which we don't have time to go into. Last slide, I think. But it's an important one. So what are the consequences for environmental professionals working within aid agencies and in the developing overseas development assistance world? When aid agencies were involved in mega projects, dams and corridors and the like, then people with environmental impact, project-specific environmental impact assessment were required, and so were the skills involved in that. But as this shift moved away from large-scale mega projects to direct budgetary support, we needed something very different. And that's, would you believe, where we started to talk about, instead of environmental impact assessments at the project level, strategic environmental assessment as a governance tool, policy analysis, so that we did strategic environmental assessment of the direct budgetary support that was being dispersed, trying to understand what the environmental social consequences of that are, which is very difficult because you don't really know until you've had a chat to the government what they plan to spend it on. So you certainly couldn't do an EIA because you haven't got a project yet. Okay, if we've got time constraints, I think that's probably it from me.
So the idea is to build on what Jon was saying. Look, there is obviously a landscape of key players when it comes to SDGs and investment flows over these development aid, but also more increasingly also private sector investment. And we from our research, when we sort of spot an area where we see there is evidence that there is room for improvement, where we identify an issue, how can we go about and influence those decision makers? And I just thought I'll give you a few sort of insights from the work that I've been doing in this space, a couple of observations. Then we can flip over to Jinping, who's working on this in a context of Chinese investments also around the Belt and Roads Initiative. And then I guess that should give us a good sort of room to discuss this, but then more importantly also move into the second session where we're going to explore this further and give you a bit of time to maybe think through, how would you approach this in your own research context, and what are sort of the key steps, and is there anything you think is missing? Do you need some help and support? So I will keep this brief. So I'll just reflect on some one example, which is sort of embedded in the SDGs, and it's a particular element that I've been doing quite a lot of work with. It's this idea of increasing sort of climate resilience through development aid, but also infrastructure investments. And as a starting point, I think what is really important is that you have a good storyline, a good narrative, where you kind of explain, what the issue is, but also then, sort of, keep it simple, but also sort of generate a good platform for further engagement. So I usually, call this a storyline and narrative. And I don't want to go into detail. I assume a lot of you are with these challenges, but it's just an example. I think that is a really important point, regardless with whom you communicate. You need to have a good storyline and narrative. And then the next point is, and I've sort of put this here in bold, is focus on evidence or a particular point that actually sort of gets us to the core of the issue, and that can be various things. In this case, it is this imbalance of funds that we are just inherently reactive when it comes to addressing risk. And if you look at the international sort of landscape of flows of development assistance, but also investment flows, you know, the money usually flows after an event, and it deals with, you know, with repair, recovery, humanitarian efforts, which is of course usually important, but at the same time we're just completely underspending when it comes to preparedness, risk reduction, and adaptation. So that's kind of the issue here, if you like, or also the thing that I'm trying to influence. So I think it helps if you kind of have a way to just sort of bring that home, and, you know, even if it's just like a statement such as the one that you can read here, that sort of just shows the imbalance. And you basically, I mean, it's hard to disagree that this is an issue when you see it that way. So, you know, that's kind of related to the storyline and the narrative. And then I think what obviously then, if you want to engage and start to address this, I mean, pointing out what the problem is one thing. And, you know, that might, if you're lucky, might get you the ear of someone, but often they will agree that it is a problem. But what you then need to get, you know, get people's attention to is sort of a different approach. You know, what can be amended? What are the options? How can we address it? In this context, we developed a new framework, actually together with the World Bank and also with ODI, a new sort of, we call it the triple resilient dividend. So it is a framework, and I think the idea there is you point out what the problem is, you do some research, underpin that with some evidence, and then you develop together, you know, a tool. And with that, you are fairly well equipped to have a conversation and to also then sit down and say, look, can we just run this through in the context of, you know, your particular country, your particular project. And yeah, I think that sort of gives you a neat set of tools. So I'm just illustrating, but what you then, and this is kind of really sort of my own observations, is, you know, that alone is a good starting point. And, you know, you might have a paper, you might have even a book, you might have, you know, something to show, you might have worked very hard with some key stakeholders to develop that concept and that framework. But unfortunately, you know, that is already quite good, but, well, the fun doesn't stop there because, you know, that is kind of my own observation. I mean, it is a really long haul game. And basically the first big, you know, I don't know, lesson or thing that I also learned the hard way is, you know, you just need to repeat your message and use whatever forms and channels you can find. And if at some point you feel like, well, you know, I'm really getting bored and I can't stand it anymore, then you're probably getting close to actually reaching a certain level. So that's kind of a really interesting observation. I think particularly a lot of younger researchers at the early start of their career often feel, you know, I've made my point, now I can move to something else. And, you know, I think from a research point of view, I would completely agree. From policy engagement point of view, you know, that's actually when the whole thing only starts. And so here I've just illustrated different ways. I mean, policy briefs, giving talks and engaging commentators. I mean, whatever options exist, but never really assume that people read these things. And it requires a lot of time and effort, and that's another observation. And at Grantham, we're lucky. We also have a policy team that supports this. But, you know, it is important not to assume that your influencing stops once you have put out a research paper. So just to bring us up close and then, just leave you with a couple of my own sort of observations. And I think, you know, there are no general rules, and Chun-Ping will have sort of maybe slightly different views, but also can share her own experience. So, you know, I think it is important to establish a rapport, and also, you know, if you're serious about influencing certain practices, you know, I would actually recommend, if there's any chance, particularly for young researchers, also spend the time on the other side. You know, I mean, sometimes there's secondment or placement ideas, and, you know, in my case, I used to work actually in the private sector before I went into academia. So, you know, just trying to use any opportunity that you can get to better understand how those who you're trying to influence tick and how they work. And that relates to know your audience and choosing terminology and methods accordingly. I mean, in my case, working with policymakers in private sector requires different approaches, different terminologies, and so on. And then this point I made, be persistent. You know, it's a long-term undertaking. So really, you know, don't leave it with, you know, just one level of engagement. If you want to see change, you know, you need to be, persistent. And that the other thing, don't expect decision makers to read papers. So I think we're getting, the academic community gets much better, and we're using different formats and videos and webinars. And I mean, you know, the choice is there, but I also still think that, you know, there are missed opportunities, and sometimes decision makers are also not clear themselves about what they need. And sometimes it's really down to, I don't know, coincidence, and just talking to the right person at the right time. So you can't really plan for that. But yeah, I mean, there are lots of things also in that come down to, I don't know, understanding processes and what you're trying to influence and what the right time for that is.